In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory, a lone woman makes a choice that will echo across a decade. She finds a lost Apache boy, more dead than alive, and instead of turning him away, she opens her home and her heart. She raises him as her own, a secret kept from a hateful world. But the wild always calls to its own. 10 years of silence pass a lifetime in the brutal West. And then one day, a rider appears on the horizon. It is the boy she lost, now a war chief, a leader of men riding at the head of a nation. And he has come back for her. The sky over the San Simon Valley in 1868 was the color of a fresh bruise. Elara Hayes, her face etched with the dual hardships of sun and sorrow, secured the last of the shutters on her small ranch house. The wind, a hot, angry breath, tore at her calico dress and whipped stray strands of auburn hair across her brow. It was a squall of unnatural fury, the kind that old-timers said scraped the devil's secrets from the canyon floors and hurled them across the plains. Just 2 years a widow, Elara, ran the Ponderosa Springs Ranch with a resilience that baffled the men in the nearby town of Redemption. Her husband Daniel had left her the 300 acres of prime grazing land and a heart full of memories, but it was her own grit that kept the place from being swallowed by the desert, or more menacingly, by Jedediah Thorne. Thorne owned the sprawling T-Bar ranch that bordered her property on 3 sides, and he viewed her small plot of land not as a home, but as an irritating interruption in his cattle empire. He'd made offers first, polite, then condescending, and lately thinly veiled threats delivered by his leering ranch hands. Elara ignored them. This land was Daniel's dream, and now it was hers. As the first fat drops of rain splattered against the adobe walls, she pulled her shawl tighter and cast a worried glance towards the corral where her 2 sturdy horses huddled together. It was then she heard it, a sound almost lost in the rising shriek of the wind. It was a faint, desperate cry like a wounded coyote pup. Her hand went instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at her hip, a constant companion in this untamed land. She peered out from the porch, her eyes scanning the landscape, now a blurry watercolor of gray and brown. The sound came again, closer this time, from the direction of the dry creek bed that marked the southern edge of her property. Caution warred with a deeper, more ingrained instinct, the one that had made her stitch up a wounded calf and nurse a broken-winged hawk back to health. Tugging her hat down, she ventured into the storm. The rain came in sheets, turning the dust to a slick, treacherous mud. She followed the arroyo, the wind trying to push her back, until she saw a small, huddled shape, half submerged in the flash flood, beginning to churn through the creek bed. It was a boy, no older than 8 or 9. His skin was the rich red-brown of the earth, his black hair plastered to his skull. He was clad only in a tattered breechcloth, and his small body was a canvas of scrapes and bruises. But it was the gash on his temple, deep and dark, that bled sluggishly into the rising water. He was Apache. In Redemption, that word was a curse. The Chiricahua Apache were ghosts of the mountains, feared and hated. Stories of their raids of stolen livestock and burned-out homesteads were currency in the town saloon. To be found harboring one, especially a child who could one day become a warrior, was to invite ruin. The townsfolk would see it as a betrayal. Thorne would see it as the perfect excuse to run her off her land for good. The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, fathomless, and filled with a terror so profound it stole Elara's breath. He didn't scream or fight. He simply watched her, his body trembling uncontrollably from cold and pain, his spirit seemingly already surrendered to the end. In that moment, he wasn't an Apache. He wasn't the boogeyman from the saloon stories. He was a child alone and dying in a storm. Ilara's heart, a fortress she had built around her grief for Daniel, cracked open. She waded into the churning water, the cold biting at her ankles, and scooped his frail, surprisingly light body into her arms. He was feverish, his skin burning against hers. As she carried him back towards the warmth of her home, the storm raged around them, as if protesting her defiance of the world's harsh order. She didn't know it then, but she wasn't just carrying a lost boy out of a storm. She was carrying a secret that would redefine her life, and a future leader who would one day shake the very foundations of the territory. She laid him gently on Daniel's bed, lit a lantern, and began the work of saving his life, sealing her fate with every gentle swab of a warm cloth and every whispered word of comfort. His name, she would learn later, was Taza, and for now, in the heart of the storm, he was hers to protect. The first few weeks were a delicate dance on the edge of a knife. Taza's fever raged a wildfire in his small body. Ilara sat by his side, day and night, applying cool compresses, forcing broth between his cracked lips, and speaking to him in a soft, steady voice. She spoke of Daniel, of the stars, of the stubborn ponderosa pine that gave the ranch its name. He understood none of the words, but he seemed to understand the tone. The terror in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a wary, watchful curiosity. Her only confidant was Silas Blackwood, her one and only ranch hand. Silas was a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the landscape itself, leathery wrinkled, and with eyes that had seen more than 70 hard winters. He'd been with Daniel from the beginning. When he first saw the boy in the bed, he simply grunted, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt outside the door and said, "Well, hell, you never were one for the easy path, Ilara." But he kept her secret. Silas would ride into Redemption for supplies, deflecting questions about Ilara's bout of sickness that kept her from coming to town herself. He taught her which roots to grind for the fever, and which leaves to make into a poultice for the gash on Taza's head. When the fever finally broke, Taza awoke to a new world. He was weak but lucid. He watched Ilara with the unnerving stillness of a hawk, his gaze following her every move as she cooked, cleaned, and mended. He refused to speak. Words were a barrier, so they found a new language. She would point to the water bucket and say, "Water." He would watch her lips silent. The next day, when he was thirsty, he would point. She would smile, say the word again, and bring him a dipper. Slowly, painstakingly, they built a bridge of words between them, bread horse, sun moon. His Apache name he finally offered one evening was Taza. He said it softly, the sound like the rustle of dry leaves. In return, Ilara gave him a name for the white world, one that might offer him some small shield from its judgment. She called him Taz. Life settled into a new clandestine rhythm. Taz proved to be a quick study, his mind a thirsty sponge. He absorbed the workings of the ranch, not just through instruction, but through silent observation. He learned the mend of a fence, the feel of a good horse, the way to read the clouds for rain. Ilara taught him to read from an old worn Bible and a tattered copy of Shakespeare, the only two books she owned. He stumbled over the strange angular letters, but he persevered, his brow furrowed in concentration. In return, he taught her his world. He showed her how to track a deer by a barely there hoof print, how to find water by watching the flight of a bee. He taught her the Apache words for the things around them, the people, sun, night. He would sit and carve his small hands, surprisingly deft, transforming scraps of wood into detailed figures of lizards, eagles, and horses. He was a boy caught between two currents, learning the ways of the settler, while the soul of a warrior beat quietly within him. The constant low-grade threat was Jedediah Thorne. His foreman, a cruel-eyed man named Caleb Flint, would occasionally ride the property line, his gaze lingering on the house. Ilara made sure Taz was always hidden when they were near. The boy learned to melt into the landscape at a moment's notice, becoming another shadow among the junipers. One sweltering afternoon, Flint and two of Thorne's men rode right up to the house. "Thorne's getting impatient, Mrs. Hayes." Flint sneered, his eyes roaming over her with insolent appraisal. "This is no place for a woman alone. He sent us to persuade you to reconsider his generous offer." Ilara stood on the porch, her back straight, the Colt heavy on her hip. "This is my home, Mr. Flint. I'm not selling. Tell your boss to stop wasting his breath and my time." Flint's lip curled. Strong words, but a fire can start real easy in this dry heat. Fences can get cut. A woman alone is vulnerable. From inside the house, a floorboard creaked. Flint's eyes narrowed, trying to peer into the dim interior. "You got company, Mrs. Hayes." Before Ilara could answer, Silas Blackwood stepped out of the barn, a double-barreled shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. "She's got me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I reckon you three have overstayed your welcome. The property line's that-a-way." Flint held Silas's gaze for a long moment, then spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled before wheeling his horse around and riding off, his men trailing behind him. Ilara's knees felt weak with relief. She turned to thank Silas, but he was looking at the house. Taz emerged from the shadows of the doorway. He wasn't holding a toy or a book. In his hand was Ilara's spare rifle, the one she kept over the mantel. He hadn't made a sound, but he had been there ready to defend his home. He looked at the departing riders with an expression of cold, ancient fury that was terrifying on a 10-year-old's face. In that moment, Ilara and Silas exchanged a look. This was more than just sheltering a lost child. They were raising him, and they were raising him to be a survivor, a boy with one foot in the world of the white man's words, and the other in the silent, deadly world of the Apache. It was a dangerous, uncertain bridge they were building, and they had no idea which side he would eventually choose to call home. The years passed, turning the scrawny, silent boy into a lean, capable young man. By the time he was 17, Taz stood taller than Ilara, with the broad shoulders of a rancher and the quiet grace of a hunter. His English was fluent, spoken with a low, thoughtful cadence, but when he was with Ilara, he still used the Apache words for the things that mattered most. My heart, he would sometimes call her, a name of profound respect and affection. He was the son she never had. He ran the ranch with a skill that surpassed even Daniel's, his Apache instincts, blending seamlessly with the knowledge Ilara and Silas had given him. He could predict a storm by the behavior of ants and fix a broken wagon wheel with equal proficiency. The secret of his existence was a fragile bubble they had maintained for nearly a decade. The few times they had to go to redemption, Taz would be introduced as Silas's distant nephew. Taz Blackwood, a quiet boy from back east. His dark features raised eyebrows, but his reserved demeanor and Silas's stony glares deflected most suspicion. But the world outside their small bubble was changing. The bluecoats, the U.S. cavalry, were more active than ever, pushing further into the Dragoon and Chiricahua mountains. The talk in town was of a final decisive campaign to force the last free Apache onto the San Carlos Reservation, a place universally described as a sweltering hellhole. The name of a new, brilliant war chief was being whispered with fear and awe, a man named Geronimo. And another, a wise and powerful leader of the Chiricahua, named Natchez. Taz would listen to these stories in silence, his face an unreadable mask, his hands often stilling over a piece of wood he was carving. Ilara could feel the pull these names had on him, the invisible thread connecting him to a life he barely remembered. The thread snapped on a crisp autumn's evening. The sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Ilara was on the porch mending a shirt, while Taz was in the corral calming a new filly. A stillness had fallen over the valley, a heavy silence that felt different from the usual peace of twilight. Then they saw them. 4 riders sitting motionless on their horses on the ridge overlooking the ranch. They were not cowboys or soldiers. They were Apache warriors, their bare-chested forms silhouetted against the dying sun. They held lances, and their presence was one of immense, unyielding authority. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She called Taza's name, her voice, tight with fear. He came to her side, his eyes fixed on the riders. There was no fear in his expression, only a profound, soul-deep recognition. One of the riders slowly dismounted and began to walk down the hill towards the ranch house. He was older than the others, his face a roadmap of wisdom and hardship, his long grey hair held back by a simple leather band. He carried no weapon in his hands. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch. "I am Nashais," he said, his voice clear and strong, speaking surprisingly good English. "We have been searching for many seasons. We followed the story of a lost boy, carried away by a flash flood after a cavalry attack that scattered our families. A story told by a captured scout who saw a white woman carrying the boy from the arroyo." He looked directly at Taz, and his stern face softened with something akin to wonder. "The spirits have guided us to this place. You have the eyes of your father, who was a great warrior." Taz stood frozen, the world he had known for 10 years, tilting on its axis. Ilara put a protective hand on his arm, but he barely seemed to notice. "We have come for Taza of the people." Natchez continued, his gaze shifting to Ilara. "We thank you for his life. You showed him a kindness our people haven't known from your race. For this, you will always be remembered by the Chiricahua. But his place is with us. The people are fighting for their survival. We need every one of our sons." The choice was not Ilara's to make. It was Taz's. She looked at him, her heart breaking, and saw the terrible conflict tearing him apart. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a decade of shared sunrises, quiet evenings, and unspoken love. Then he looked at Natchez, at the warriors on the ridge, and she saw the call of his blood, the echo of the drum that had been beating silently in his soul all along. Taz started, his voice rough with emotion. He couldn't finish. Ilara knew. To force him to stay would be to cage an eagle. "It is your decision, Taz," she said, her own voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "You must go where your heart tells you." He walked slowly towards Natchez, then stopped and turned back to Ilara. In just a few strides he crossed the distance between them and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. He was no longer a boy, but a man strong and unyielding. "I will not forget you, my heart," he whispered into her hair, using the sacred name for the last time. "Never." He pulled away his face, a mask of grief. From his belt, he unhooked a small, intricately carved wooden eagle, its wings outstretched. He pressed it into her hand. "So you do not forget me." Then he turned without another word and walked towards Natchez. He did not look back. Ilara stood on the porch, clutching the wooden eagle, its sharp edges digging into her palm. She watched as he mounted a spare horse the warriors had brought. She watched as the 5 riders turned and disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by the twilight. The silence that descended was absolute, a crushing weight that was far heavier than any storm. The ranch, once a sanctuary, was now just an empty house. The son she had raised, the boy she had saved, was gone. He had ridden back into the world that had birthed him, leaving Ilara utterly and completely alone once more. The 10 years that followed were a study in erosion. The world, like the wind on the mesas, wore away at Ilara Hayes, carving new lines of grief and stubbornness onto her face. The silence Taz left behind never truly went away. It simply became the backdrop to her life, a constant low hum of absence. The ranch survived, but it did not thrive. Silas Blackwood, her loyal friend and protector, grew older, his movements slower, his cough deeper. They managed, but the work that had once been shared by 3 strong backs now fell on one woman and an aging man. Jedediah Thorne's pressure became more insidious. He no longer sent men to make open threats. Instead, a section of fence would mysteriously be cut just before a cattle drive, or the stream feeding her well would be dammed upstream for a few weeks, a clear message from the T-Bar Ranch that his patience had its limits. The country was changing with the speed of a locomotive. The talk in Redemption was no longer just about Apache raids, but about railroad lines, telegraph wires, and silver strikes. The Arizona Territory was being tamed, one steel rail and one bullet at a time. The papers reported that the Apache wars were all but over. Geronimo had surrendered. The last of the hostiles, including a formidable leader named Nachase, and his young, brilliant sub-chief, had been rounded up and shipped on trains to the humid swamps of Florida, a place designed to break their bodies and spirits. Ilara read these reports with a knot of ice in her stomach. She pictured Taz, her Taz who knew the dry, clean heat of the desert, suffocating in a humid prison thousands of miles away. She held the small wooden eagle every night, its form now smooth and dark from the oils of her hand, and prayed to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. She prayed for his survival, for his spirit to remain unbroken. She became a fixture in the valley, a curiosity. The Widow Hayes, they called her, a stubborn, solitary woman clinging to a past no one understood. She rarely went to town, and when she did, she spoke little, her eyes holding a distant, haunted look. The vibrant woman who had defied a storm to save a child had retreated into a shell of quiet resilience. In the 8th year of Taz's absence, Silas passed away peacefully in his sleep. Ilara buried him on a small hill overlooking the ranch next to the grave of her husband, Daniel. Now she was truly alone. She sold off half her cattle, keeping only a small herd she could manage herself. Thorne, seeing his opportunity, immediately bought the adjacent land she had to let go his ranch, now pressing in on her from all sides like a slow-moving python. He sent his lawyer with a final insulting offer. She tore up the paper in the man's face. The fight had gone out of her, but the stubbornness remained. The ranch was a memorial, now not just to Daniel, but to Silas, and to the boy who had filled its rooms with quiet purpose for nearly 10 years. To give it up would be to admit they had all been erased. On the 10th anniversary of the day, he left Ilara sat on her porch as the sun set the same fiery colors painting the sky. She was 42 years old, but felt a century older. Her auburn hair was streaked with grey, her hands permanently chapped and calloused. She held the wooden eagle in her lap, tracing its familiar shape. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her eye. It wasn't the slow plume of a lone rider. It was large, organized. Cavalry, she thought, with a jolt of alarm, or perhaps Thorne and his men finally coming to end things. She stood up, her hand resting on the worn grip of her Colt, her body tensing for a final, hopeless confrontation. As the riders drew closer, she saw they were not soldiers or cowboys. They were Native Americans riding with a proud, disciplined bearing. At their head rode a man on a magnificent black stallion. He was tall in the saddle, wearing not the breechcloth and lance of a raider, but fringed buckskin, leggings, a simple shirt, and a single eagle feather in his long black hair. His face was stern, majestic, and achingly familiar. The riders stopped at the edge of her property, the same spot where Nache's warriors had stopped a decade before. The leader dismounted and walked towards her. He moved with the same fluid grace she remembered, but it was now imbued with an unshakable authority, the confidence of a man who had commanded others in battle and in council. He stopped before the porch, his dark eyes searching her face, taking in the grey in her hair, the lines around her eyes, the weary slump of her shoulders. "Ilara," he said. His voice was deeper now, a resonant baritone that held the gravel of command and the echo of immense suffering. It was a voice she had heard every night in her dreams. She could barely breathe. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "Taz," she whispered the name, a fragile thing she hadn't spoken aloud in 10 years. "My people call me Taza Nantan of the Chiricahua," he said, his expression softening as he looked at her. "But for you, I will always be Taz." It was him. The boy was gone, replaced by this formidable man, this leader. But the eyes were the same. In their depths she saw the Florida swamps, the loss of his people, the weight of a nation on his shoulders. And she saw something else too, the same profound, unwavering affection that had been there the day he left. He was home, but he hadn't come back alone. He had brought the world with him. The shock was a physical blow, leaving Ilara breathless and swaying on her feet. This man before her was a stranger, yet he was the most familiar person in the world. The boy who had learned to read by her hearthfire now stood as a living embodiment of the stories whispered in fear and awe across the territory. A Nantan, a chief. "They said you were in Florida," she finally managed, her voice raspy. "They said you were all prisoners." A flicker of a bitter memory crossed his face. "We were, for many years. A sickness took Naches and many of our elders. But the world changes. A new government in Washington decided it was cheaper to negotiate than to fight a ghost. They brought a few of us back, those who survived, to act as intermediaries with the bands still hiding in the Sierra Madre. They think we will convince them to surrender." He gave a humorless smile. "They gave me back my name, but they think they own my voice." His delegation of 6 warriors remained mounted, their faces impassive, their rifles held in sheaths of beaded leather. They were not prisoners. They were emissaries of a proud, battered but unbroken people. "Why are you here, Taz?" Ilara asked the question, heavy with a decade of unspoken hopes and fears. "At my ranch. Our destination is Fort Bowie for the talks, but I told the army major that my path here was not negotiable." Taza said, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, noting the peeling paint on the barn, the smaller herd in the pasture, the 2 lonely graves on the hill. His eyes saw everything. "I had to see. I had to know if you were safe." The simple admission undid her. A wall she had carefully constructed around her heart for 10 long years crumbled into dust. Tears she hadn't shed since Silas's funeral welled in her eyes. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Taza took a step onto the porch, his movement hesitant, as if unsure of his welcome. He reached out not to touch her, but held his hand in the space between them, a gesture of profound respect. "You have suffered," he stated, his voice soft with a shared sorrow. "I managed," she said, her voice thick. "Silas, he's gone." Taza's gaze flickered to the graves on the hill, and he nodded slowly. He was a good man. He stood between us and the world. The arrival of the Apache delegation did not go unnoticed. A rider from the T-Bar ranch patrolling the ridge had seen them. Within 2 hours, the news had spread like wildfire to Redemption, and more importantly, to Jedediah Thorne. For Thorne, this was not a reunion. It was an opportunity. An Apache war chief, one of the famous hostiles, camped on the widow Hayes' land. It was the perfect pretext. That evening, as Taza's men set up a small, disciplined camp near the creek, he and Elara sat at her kitchen table. The silence between them was filled with the weight of unspoken years. He told her of the horrors of the Florida prison, of watching his people die from disease and despair. He spoke of Nache's last words, instructing him to learn the white man's ways of words and laws, to fight for the people, not just with arrows but with treaties. He had been chosen to lead, not because of his skill in battle, but because he understood both worlds. Elara, in turn, told him of her lonely struggle of Silas's decline, and of Thorne's relentless, suffocating pressure. As she spoke, she saw a dangerous light kindle in Taza's eyes. The boy who had once stood in the doorway with a rifle was still there, beneath the calm exterior of the Nantan. "He will not trouble you again," Taza said the statement, a flat, cold promise. "Taz, no," Elara said quickly, placing a hand on his arm. The feel of his skin, warm and real, sent a jolt through her. "This is not the way. You are here to make peace. Starting a war with Thorne will ruin everything." He looked at her hand on his arm, and their eyes met. The years fell away. In that moment, he was not the Nantan, and she was not the weathered widow. They were just Taz and Elara, two souls bound by a shared past that was suddenly powerfully present. The air grew thick with a different kind of tension, the ghost of a love that had never been named but had nurtured them both. A shout from outside shattered the moment. One of Taza's warriors appeared at the door. "Nantan riders are coming. Many of them." Taza was on his feet in an instant, his transformation back into the war chief, seamless and chilling. He and Elara stepped onto the porch. In the moonlight, they could see at least a dozen men on horseback, cresting the hill, their forms dark and menacing. At their head was Jedediah Thorne, and beside him the town sheriff, a man named Marcus Cole, whose loyalty Thorne had long since purchased. Elara Hayes. Thorne's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with false righteousness. "I'm here with the law. We have it on good authority. You're harboring a dangerous hostile, a murderer of innocent folk. Send him out, or we're coming in to get him." Taza's warriors had already formed a line, their rifles now in their hands, the moonlight glinting off the steel barrels. They were outnumbered 2-1, but they stood as firm as the mountains behind them. Taza stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Elara. He did not shout. His voice carried across the distance with quiet, lethal authority. "I am Taza Nantan, of the Chiricahua Apache. I am here under the protection and authority of the United States Army on official government business," he announced. "You are interfering with federal matters, Sheriff, and you, Thorne," his voice dropped, laced with contempt, "you have been a thorn in the side of this land and this woman for too long. Take your men and leave. Now." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Listen to him, giving orders. This is our land, Apache. We make the laws here, light the torches." Several of his men produced torches, their flames sputtering to life, casting a hellish dancing light over the scene. Their intent was clear. They hadn't just come to arrest Taza. They had come to burn the Ponderosa Springs ranch to the ground. The night air, once cool and serene, crackled with menace. The torchlight threw monstrous shadows that danced and writhed against the walls of Elara's home. Thorn's men, their faces illuminated in the demonic glow, were a mob, their individual cruelties now merged into a singular, hateful purpose. Sheriff Cole sat his horse, uncomfortably, a man who had clearly lost control of the situation he had helped create. "This is your last chance. Hayes." Thorn bellowed, his face a mask of triumphant rage. "Give up the savage, or we'll burn you out with him." Ilara stood her ground beside Taza, the old Colt in her hand, feeling solid and familiar. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but seeing Taza's calm, resolute profile beside her ignited a spark of defiance she hadn't felt in years. She hadn't saved this boy from a storm, only to lose the man to a pack of jackals. "This is my property, Jedediah," she called out, her voice ringing with surprising strength. "You and your hired thugs are trespassing. Get off my land." Taza didn't waste any more words on Thorn. He issued a short, sharp command in Apache. His 6 warriors instantly melted back from the open yard. 2 flanked the house, 2 vanished into the darkness of the barn, and 2 dropped to the ground behind the stone well, all finding cover with an efficiency that was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. They were a single, intelligent organism of war. "Fool woman!" Thorn roared, enraged by their defiance. "Burn it. Burn the barn first." 2 of his riders' torches, held high, spurred their horses towards the barn. It was the heart of the ranch where Silas had spent his last years filled with dry hay. It would go up like a tinderbox. Before they had covered half the distance, 2 rifle shots cracked from the darkness near the barn. The reports were simultaneous, a testament to years of training. The torches, not the men, were the targets. Both were struck, flying from the riders' hands and extinguishing in the dirt. The 2 riders reined in their horses, suddenly realizing they were charging into a darkness that could see them perfectly. Thorn was stunned into a momentary silence. He had expected a cowering woman and a cornered savage. He had not expected disciplined, invisible resistance. "They're in the barn. Fire at the barn!" He screamed, his plan devolving into chaotic fury. A volley of undisciplined shots erupted from Thorn's men. Splinters flew from the barn's wooden walls. From inside, Taza's warriors returned fire, not a wild spray of bullets, but methodical, precise shots. One of Thorn's men cried out as a bullet tore through his shoulder. Another's hat was shot clean off his head. They weren't shooting to kill, Ilara realized with a shock. They were shooting to dismantle, to terrify, to prove their complete superiority. Taza pulled Ilara back against the adobe wall of the house. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Keep low." He raised his own rifle, a Winchester, that looked like an extension of his arm. He wasn't looking at the mob. He was scanning the darkness on the flanks. He had fought this kind of battle before. He knew Thorn was a blunt instrument, but his foreman, Caleb Flint, was a snake. As if summoned by the thought, a flicker of movement near the corral caught his eye. Flint and another man had dismounted and were creeping along the fence line, trying to get a clear angle on the house on Ilara. Taza brought the Winchester to his shoulder. He didn't seem to aim. He simply became one with the rifle. He fired once. A pained yell cut through the night as Flint's rifle clattered to the ground, his hand shattered by Taza's bullet. Flint staggered back, clutching his ruined hand, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. The display of precise, overwhelming force began to unravel the mob's courage. These weren't the drunken savages from Thorn's stories. These were ghosts, striking from the shadows with deadly accuracy. "Sheriff!" Thorn yelled, his voice now laced with panic. "Do something! This is an insurrection!" Sheriff Cole, who had been trying to make himself as small a target as possible, finally acted. "Hold your fire!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "In the name of the law, everybody hold your fire." Slowly the shooting subsided. The night was suddenly loud with the ringing in their ears, the smell of gunpowder, and the groans of the two injured men. Into this tense silence, Taza stepped out from the porch. He walked calmly to the center of the yard, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was completely exposed, a solitary figure in the moonlight. It was an act of supreme confidence, a leader's move. "This is over," Taza said, his voice carrying to every man. "You came here tonight to burn a woman out of her home. You followed a liar and a coward." He fixed his gaze on Thorn. "You have terrorized this woman for years. You have tried to steal her land. Tonight it ends." He then turned his attention to the sheriff. "Sheriff Cole, I am, as I told you, on a diplomatic mission for the United States government. Major Samuel Crenshaw at Fort Bowie is expecting me. When I tell him that the local law in the pay of this man," he gestured to Thorn, "led a mob to attack my delegation and murder a U.S. citizen on her own property, your career will be the least of your concerns. You will find yourself in a federal prison." The sheriff's face went pale. He knew the name. Major Crenshaw was a hard by-the-book officer with no patience for local corruption. Thorn saw his power evaporating. In a final desperate act, he drew his own pistol and aimed it at Taza. "You'll never make it to the Fort Apache." Before he could pull the trigger, another shot rang out, this one from the porch. It was not from an Apache rifle. It was the loud, distinctive boom of an old Colt peacemaker. Jedediah Thorn's pistol flew from his grasp as Ilara's bullet struck it dead center, mangling the steel and numbing his entire arm. He stared at his empty, stinging hand, then at Ilara, who stood on the porch, smoke curling from the barrel of her revolver, her face set like stone. "Get off my land." She said each word as hard and sharp as a shard of rock. The fight was over. The mob broken and humiliated. Their leader, disarmed by a woman they had dismissed for years, began to back away. Sheriff Cole, eager to salvage his future, began barking orders officially placing Thorn under arrest for incitement and assault. As the disgraced posse retreated into the darkness, taking their wounded with them, Taza walked back to the porch. He stood before Ilara, his eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't quite name, pride, awe, and a profound, rekindled love. He gently took the Colt from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "You never were one for the easy path, Ilara Hayes," he said, softly echoing Silas's words from so many years ago. In the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the scent of gunpowder and the deep peace of the desert night, they both knew that more than just a ranch had been defended. A bond stretched across a decade of pain and silence had been forged anew in the heart of the fire. The sunrise that followed the night of the attack was quiet and clear, as if the desert itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The air was clean washed of the hate and violence of the preceding hours. Thorn and his foreman Flint were in the redemption jail, awaiting the arrival of federal marshals, summoned by a now terrified Sheriff Cole. The story of how the reclusive widow Hayes and a handful of Apache warriors had dismantled Thorn's power overnight was already becoming a local legend. Taza's warriors were breaking their small camp by the creek. Their work here was done. The negotiations at Fort Bowie awaited them, and with them the fate of their people. Ilara and Taza stood on the porch, a pot of fresh coffee steaming on the railing between them. For the first time in 10 years, the silence between them was not one of absence, but of comfortable shared understanding. They had faced the fire together and emerged unscathed. "You must go," Ilara said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Taza replied, his eyes on the distant mountains. "My future. It is not my own. It belongs to the people. I must fight for them at the negotiating table now, not in the hills." Ilara's heart ached with the familiar pang of impending loss, But this time it was different. It was not the desperate sorrow of a mother losing her child, but the bittersweet understanding of a woman seeing the great man he had become. "You will be their Nantan," she said, a statement of pure fact. "You will be a great one." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "Everything I learned of honor, of mercy, of fighting for a home, I learned it here in this house, from you." He reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled something out. It was a piece of wood, half carved into the shape of a hawk. "I tried to finish this in Florida, to remember the feeling of the sun and the ponderosa pines. But the wood there was wrong. The air was wrong." He looked at her, and the carefully constructed walls of the stoic chief finally fell away, revealing the man beneath. "Elara, my fight is for my people. My duty is to them. But my heart, in Chupika, it has never left this porch." He was offering her a truth, not a promise. He could not stay and build a life with her here. He could not abandon his nation, especially now when they needed his unique voice to navigate the treacherous world of the white man. And she, in turn, could not leave this land. It was in her bones, soaked with the memories of Daniel Silas and the boy she had raised. It was her anchor in the world. She reached out and took his hand, the one not holding the carving, her calloused fingers intertwined with his. A hawk needs the whole sky to fly, Taz. Not a cage, no matter how loving. She understood, and in that understanding he saw a love greater and more profound than any simple promise of a shared future could ever be. It was a love that asked for nothing but his freedom to be the leader he was born to be. His warriors were mounted, waiting. He squeezed her hand, a final firm pressure that conveyed everything he couldn't say. He walked down the steps, then turned back one last time. "This is not the end," he said, his voice a vow. "Fort Bowie is only 2 days' ride from here. A Nantan has business to attend to in the valley from time to time." A slow smile spread across Elara's face, the first genuine, hopeful smile in a decade. It was not a goodbye. It was the beginning of something new. A different kind of life, one lived in the spaces between two worlds. A life of visits of letters carried by trusted scouts of a shared purpose, even when they were apart. She watched him mount his black stallion, a figure of breathtaking authority. He raised a hand to her in farewell, then turned and led his delegation east towards the rising sun and the future of his people. Elara Hayes remained on the porch, the warmth of his hand still tingling on her skin. She looked at her ranch, her home. It was no longer a place of ghosts and memory, but a place of strength, a sanctuary that had stood against the worst of men. She was not the lonely widow Hayes anymore. She was Elara, protector of this land friend to the Nantan of the Chiricahua, and a woman whose heart, once broken, was now full. She was a bridge between two worlds, standing firm and strong, right where two rivers of destiny had met and decided to flow for a time together. The weeks following the confrontation settled into a profound and unfamiliar quiet. It was not the hollow silence of loneliness that Elara had endured for a decade, but a peaceful, watchful stillness. The Ponderosa Springs Ranch was no longer an island of defiance in a hostile sea. It was now a landmark, a place spoken of in hushed, respectful tones in the saloons and general stores of redemption. The name Hayes, once synonymous with stubborn widowhood, was now inextricably linked with the formidable name of Taza Nantan of the Chiricahua. Elara felt the shift most acutely on her first trip into town for supplies. As she rode her steady mare down the dusty main street, conversations dwindled. Men on the boardwalk stopped whittling to watch her pass. They tipped their hats, their eyes holding not the pity she was used to, but a mixture of awe and caution. She was no longer just Alara Hayes. She was the woman who had faced down Jedediah Thorne's mob, the woman a legendary Apache chief called a friend. Inside Henderson's mercantile, the proprietor, who had often been short with her credit, hurried to serve her himself, his demeanor obsequious. "Anything you need, Mrs. Hayes. Anything at all. Just put it on your account." As she was leaving, Sheriff Cole approached her, his hat in his hands. He looked 10 years older, the swagger gone from his walk. "Ma'am," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Just wanted to inform you that Thorne and Flint have been transferred to the federal penitentiary at Yuma. We won't be seeing them again." He cleared his throat. "Major Crenshaw from Fort Bowie sends his personal assurances that no further harm will come to you or your property." It was a clear message. Taza's words carried the weight of the United States Army. She was protected, but it was on her ride home that the true nature of her new reality became clear. A woman rushed out to intercept her on the edge of town. Alara recognized her as Martha Miller, the wife of one of Thorne's men who had been shot in the shoulder. Alara tensed, expecting a confrontation. Instead, the woman twisted a handkerchief in her hands. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My Ben. He's healing. He told me. He said that Apache could have shot him through the heart. He aimed for the shoulder. He said none of them were shooting to kill." She looked up, her eyes full of a grudging respect. I just wanted to say that." She turned and hurried away before Alara could respond. Taza had not only defeated Thorne with force, he had done so with honor, and in doing so had begun to change the hearts of the very people who had feared him. A month after he had left, as the autumn chill began to bite, a rider appeared on the ridge. Alara's heart leapt, but she knew it was not him. This was a young Apache, brave, no older than Taz had been when he'd left. He rode down cautiously, stopping a respectful distance away and dismounting. He spoke no English, but his gestures were clear. He held out a bundle wrapped in soft deer hide. After he had gone, Alara unwrapped it. Inside were things she could not buy, rare mountain herbs for the winter aches. She'd complained of a sinew-backed bow that was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, and a small, heavy pouch of unground coffee beans, a luxury he knew she loved. Beneath it all lay the hawk, the one he had started carving in Florida. It was finished now. Every feather was exquisitely detailed, its eyes seeming to hold a fierce, wild intelligence. He had finished it with desert wood under a desert sky. It was a message more eloquent than any letter. "I am home. I am whole. I remember." Her protection was silent but constant. One morning she found the fence to the north pasture, cut a final petty act of vengeance from one of Thorne's last loyal men. As she gathered her tools for the long day of repairs, 2 Apache scouts appeared, as if from the earth itself. They did not speak to her, but simply nodded, and with a quiet efficiency that defied belief, had the entire fence line mended and reinforced within an hour. Then, just as silently, they were gone. Alara Hayes was no longer alone. Her ranch, once a lonely outpost, had become an embassy, a bridge between 2 worlds. She was its sole keeper, a quiet queen in a kingdom of one her domain, watched over by the unseen eyes of the son she had raised, the chief she had loved, and the man whose heart, like hers, would forever be tied to the Ponderosa. The story of Alara and Taza isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's a story about the bridges we build in the most unlikely of places. It's about how a single act of kindness can echo through a decade, changing the course of history for families and for entire nations. Their love wasn't about possession. It was about sacrifice, respect, and the courage to let someone be who they were meant to be. It reminds us that the strongest bonds aren't the ones that tie us down, but the ones that give us the strength to fight our own battles, knowing someone somewhere is standing with us in spirit. If this story of courage, love, and the untamed heart of the West moved you, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales of history, heart, and the enduring human spirit. Thank you for listening.